if you are a consumer of independent news, then the first place you should be going to is Consortium News, and please do try to support them when you can. It doesn't have its articles behind a paywall. It's free for everyone. It's one of the best news sites out there, and it's been in the business of independent journalism and adversarial independent journalism for over 2 decades. I hope that with the public's continuing support of Consortium News, it will continue for a very long time to come. Thank you so much.
Contribute some serious money.
Welcome to CN Live, Season 2, Episode 15, Drama in the Court. I'm Joe Lauria, Editor-in-Chief of Consortium News.
And I'm Elizabeth Voss.
The first week of the resumed extradition hearing of imprisoned WikiLeaks publisher Julian Assange is over, and there was drama throughout the shortened week. It began on Monday with the last-minute acceptance of a U.S. superseding indictment by Magistrate Vanessa Baraitser, followed by the rearrest of Assange on a new extradition request from the United States. After that, there was a last-minute request by the defense to allow more time for them to prepare for this new indictment. That was denied by Baraitser. On that first day, 40 civil society groups had their remote video access revoked by Baraitser. Consortium News has been able to follow every moment in the courtroom via remote video. On day 2, the government revealed a strategy to focus only on released WikiLeaks documents that contained the names of informants. Prosecutor James Lewis QC said Assange was not being charged with releasing any other documents, which brought an outburst from Julian Assange inside his glass cage of nonsense. Baraitser warned he'd be removed from the trial if he did that again. Reading from the indictment, the defense showed that it was indeed nonsense, as Assange was being charged with possessing and disseminating an array of classified material, not just those restricted to naming informants. While there is no statute against revealing informants' names, as there is for unmasking a government agent, for instance, the prosecution argued that an informant's name is defense information and thereby protected by the Espionage Act. The government here seems to want it both ways. They're appealing to the public and the media and saying Assange isn't being prosecuted for possessing and disseminating classified material as journalists do routinely, but only because he's an ogre and released names of informants, endangering them, which is not a crime. The afternoon of day 2 saw the wilting of a defense witness, journalism professor Mark Feldstein, under a barrage of bullying questioning by Lewis. On day 3, defense witness Trevor Timm, the executive director of the Freedom of the Press Foundation, who will be joining us in this webcast, dismantled key elements of the government's case, pointing out that Congress voted down a bill to criminalize revealing informants' names, meaning it was not against the law. Lewis was reduced to trying to undermine Timm's credibility because he did not include a statement from a U.S. assistant attorney which said Assange wasn't a journalist and wasn't being prosecuted for publishing. Timm responded that he did not rely on government press releases and instead studied the indictment to determine that the assistant U.S. attorney was wrong. Day 4, Thursday, brought more drama as the hearing was adjourned until Monday because of the coronavirus scare. A member of the prosecution team had to be tested. The result was negative, and the court will resume Monday morning. Joining us to discuss these events and the legal strategies involved are journalist Stefania Maurizi, the Italian journalist who has partnered with WikiLeaks to publish some of its biggest releases and whose freedom of information requests expose corruption surrounding the Swedish process against Assange, and by Alexander Mercouris, a British legal analyst and editor of the Duran, who has particular insights into the UK justice system. While we wait for Trevor Timm to join us in a few minutes, we have about 8 minutes, I'd like to do a lightning round with both of you, Stefania and Alexander, to give you 2 to 3 minutes each to give me your impressions of the first week. It's not exactly the association game, so whereas, for example, I'd say Lewis and you'd say bully, but I want you to give me a very succinct idea. Let me start with you, Stefania. You watched the proceedings via remote access. What did you take away from the first week?
So first of all, Joe, I think the first week was rather good for Julian Assange. I was really shocked about the decision by the judge, Vanessa Bareitzer, to allow the second superseding indictment. This indictment was served at the last minute. It was made public at the end of June, and at that time, Julian had no access to his lawyers. It was notified. It was notified to the court at the very last minute, and that superseding indictment really makes no sense to me because it introduces no charges, but it tried to depict Julian Assange as an hacker for some facts going back to 2011, which were fully investigated. They resulted in a sentence where some young hackers, basically under the FBI entrapment, basically were charged, put in prison for 10 years, some of them, like Jeremy Hammond. And those documents, which basically I analyzed for many months with WikiLeaks as a media partner of WikiLeaks, revealed important information in the public interest. And there is no doubt about this. For example, those documents about Stratford, the private intelligence company, US private intelligence company, were revealing how the Stratford company was monitoring the activists who had who were trying to, the family of the victims by the Union Carbide, the Bhopal incident in India. So it was definitely information in the public interest. Assange was never ever charged for those facts, and there is no evidence whatsoever that he was involved in the hacking. He received the materials as any journalist from sources. So, I mean, for me, that indictment makes no sense, apart from the fact that they are trying, the US government is trying to depict Julian Assange as an hacker, to make his journalistic protection weaker and weaker. They argued that he's not a journalist at all, which is very dangerous, because we should not allow the government to say who is a journalist and who is not. So from my point of view, the US is doing, what is the US is doing is very dangerous for journalism. He's trying to depict Julian Assange as an hacker. He's trying to criminalize just the fact of receiving these documents and obtaining classified information, which we do all the time as reporters. He's trying to argue that the fact that he allegedly helped Chelsea Manning to log herself into the US computers so that she could protect their identity as hacking. When, you have been a journalist, you know that we do all sorts of things to protect our sources. We call them, one of the first things I was trained as a journalist was how to call a government official without creating phone metadata. I mean, in order to protect identities of my sources. So we do these kind of tricks all the time. It's part not just of our profession, but also of our ethical requirement to protect our sources.
Alexander, bring Alexander in, and we may have 4 more minutes until
Sure.
We'll come back to you, Stefania.
Of course.
Yes, I too think, obviously from a somewhat different perspective, that I think the first week actually has not gone badly for Assange. And I'll say why. I mean, what we have seen from the US authorities and from the Crown is a continuously shifting position. What they're trying to do is, firstly, they're trying to shift away from the idea of Julian Assange being a journalist, because they realize they're in a very difficult position if they accept that he is a journalist. So they're trying to shift away from that. And they're also trying to shift away from the essence of this case, which is, however you package it, it is a clearly political case. Now, we're going to hear from Mr. Timms more about that, I've no doubt, but it is clearly a political case. So they're trying to refocus it. They started with a first indictment, which is all about, Assange helping Manning in a way that was clearly intended to help Manning conceal his identity. And this is something the journalists do, but it could be presented in a kind of way as a criminal case. And of course, that didn't really work, because the legal opinion in the United States, people like Alan Dershowitz, Andrew McCarthy, came and said, this is too inchoate, it doesn't really make much sense. And so they then moved to the Espionage Act. And the trouble with the Espionage Act allegations is that they look very obviously political. So now we have yet another indictment. It's the second superseding indictment, but it's the third in the series, which is now trying to shift back towards more obviously criminal allegations, which are involved with, helping people carry out hacking. They don't look very convincing or substantial in themselves. They are based on a person who doesn't look like a very good witness. He's got a record of criminal activity and dishonesty. And besides, I'm not even convinced that some of them are actually crimes. So they're struggling to actually, it seems to me, put forward a coherent case. At the same time, they're getting witnesses, and the prosecution, the Crown, is trying to cast doubt on whether these witnesses are experts, which they obviously are. It's trying to sort of bully them, but it cannot ultimately, it seems to me, shake the evidence these expert witnesses are giving, which is, one, he is a journalist. Two, what he is doing, what he did, what he's accused of doing is what journalists do. And three, that this is a politically motivated case. So what we see is this strange behavior from Mr. Lewis. He tries to bully and shake the witnesses. I personally don't think that looks very good or very convincing. And of course, he relies to an inordinate degree on the affidavit of Mr. Kronberg, who is, of course, the US government's attorney. So, of course, he is saying in his affidavit all the things he is saying. I mean, he is obviously not an independent or impartial witness. You cannot, it seems to me, use the witness of a lawyer in the case to try to refute the expert opinion of those who are actually experts. If this was a conventional case, I would say it was starting to look as if it was in trouble. It's not a conventional case. There's lots of politics and all sorts of things going on behind the scenes. I am, however, more hopeful after this first week, perhaps not so much in this first instance hearing, but perhaps on appeal. But I have to caution that, there are lots of things that are problematic already about these proceedings. And if the government wins on such a fragile case, everybody should realize that the position of journalists is in great jeopardy, because if they can win on these flimsy grounds against this journalist, they can win on equally flimsy grounds against all journalists.
Thank you, Alexander. We have Trevor Timm with us now. We're going to bring him in just a second. Trevor, can you hear me?
I can.
Oh,
nice to be here.
Thank you so much for joining us. We know you only got a very few minutes, so we're each going to take a crack at you. We'll have one question each, and I'm going to start it off by saying, I mean, even though you didn't see the previous testimony, you seem very well prepared for Lewis's tactics. On the question of the informants, I've been writing and saying since the beginning of this indictment that there is no statute against revealing the names of indictments. It would have been listed at the top of the indictment. And it's an interesting argument that Lewis made, and it was the first time I understood what the government was doing, that they consider the informants' names to be defense information and therefore protected by the Espionage Act. But I wanted to, and then when you brought up that the failed legislation by Lieberman it criminalized that revealing of informants, was in fact proof right there was never a crime. I want to know if you were surprised the government, this is my question, is going down this route to try to appeal to the public on the one hand by saying, and to the press, that we're not prosecuting Assange because he's not a journalist and not for possessing and disseminating classified information, but only because he's revealing names of informants, which you clearly point out is not a crime. Is that a surprise to you that they're using this strategy, and how far can they go with it?
Well, it was interesting to see that they were trying to emphasize, at least in my testimony, what was not in the indictment. They made a big deal about pointing to the Justice Department's press release around this case, saying that Julian Assange is not a journalist, we're not prosecuting journalists. But then when you read exactly what they have in the indictment, which is the actual case before the judge, what they are doing is essentially criminalizing what journalists do all the time. I mean, I think there's three parts to this that are quite disturbing. Number one, in a few counts, they are saying that merely by the fact that Julian Assange obtained this information, not that he spoke to sources, not that he was asking for information, but the literal fact that he had these documents in his possession is a crime. And we know for a fact that journalists of all stripes, in all sorts of newspapers around the country, routinely have classified information in their possession because sources have given it to them in one way or another. These charges didn't deal with publishing, but we can get to those in a second. The second set of charges is about the fact that Julian Assange obtained these documents by either asking for them publicly, saying, we would like sources to send us information on government abuses of power or illegality or corruption. And then potentially saying the same thing along the lines to Chelsea Manning in private. Now, we know that these actions are also very similar, if not the same, to what journalists do all the time. And so they're, essentially trying to pretend, because they don't think that Julian Assange is, quote unquote, a journalist, that these charges wouldn't apply to regular journalists, when we know, in fact, that they would. And then, we get to the third set of charges, which is the actual publishing of the informants' names. Now, we should back up here and say that in these first two set of charges that I'm talking about, the obtaining of the documents and the speaking to a source to obtain the documents, those cover the entire tranche of Chelsea Manning documents. So not just the documents that have informants' names on them, but the thousands and thousands of documents that journalists around the world have reported on. But when we got to the publishing of journal or the informants' names, the prosecution didn't want to talk about the legality there. They wanted to talk about whether I thought it was responsible to publish these names. And, instead of kind of playing into their games, I kind of turned it back onto them, saying, that's not the question in this case at all. The question in this case is not whether I think Julian Assange was responsible for publishing those names. the question before the court was whether or not that was illegal and violates the law. And we know for a fact that Joe Lieberman attempted to pass a bill in 2010 called the SHIELD Act that would have explicitly made this illegal. Congress chose not to pass that law. And in my mind, that tells me two things. Number one, that Congress did not think that that was illegal at the time. And number two, that they didn't think it was worthy to make legal after the fact. So, in my mind, these three aspects of the case are quite dangerous to journalists everywhere. And in my mind, all three are patently unconstitutional.
Stefania.
Yes, I mean, I completely agree with what Trevor is telling. And, it was also really bad that they try to play with words about the fact that the case is definitely not political, and they were trying to argue that basically it's not true that the Obama administration had in charge Julian Assange, and the reason why he was not charged was because he was in the embassy, which is ridiculous, because the first indictment, the first charges were brought by the Obama administration by the 21st of December 2017, and Julian was inside the embassy. So, I mean, it's complete nonsense. So, I mean, I think I agree with Alexander that they are struggling to make a coherent case, a coherent prosecution. And they realize, of course, that basically what they are doing will have extremely serious consequences on journalism, investigative journalism, because we do these kind of things all the time, all around the world. And of course, they are trying to depict him as a hacker. So, I mean, this is what they are trying now.
I'm sorry, Trevor, go on.
Well, yeah, I mean, I was just going to say, just to add on to that. Yeah, I mean, I think the prosecution is essentially trying to hide the ball with the court. They are trying to make this about everything besides what the actual charges are that Julian Assange has been indicted under. So, they're trying to point to the press release that says that Julian Assange is not a journalist. In all of the background kind of color in the indictment, they are trying to paint Julian Assange as a hacker, even though even if Julian Assange did have a hacker background, many decades ago, it's really irrelevant to the charges related to Chelsea Manning, where he clearly was acting as a journalist. And they are trying to focus the case on one single charge out of 17 or 18 charges related to this, purported failed conspiracy to violate the CFAA, which is another weak charge. But they are essentially trying to use this as a fig leaf to bring all of these other charges onto the books so that they can essentially criminalize all these journalistic behaviors. And, I hope the court can see through it. But, when you have the awesome power of the US government behind you, they can, often manipulate things in a way that makes things look either worse than they are or safer than they are when we're talking about whether the judge can extradite Assange or not. And so hopefully it got across in my testimony how dangerous this potentially could be if it goes through.
I'd like to bring in Kevin Gosztola, who's receiving a lot of praise for his tweeting during the first week of court action. Kevin is the managing editor of Shadowproof. Kevin, welcome to CN Live. Can you, floor is yours to ask Trevor a question.
Yes, Trevor. I wanted to hear from you on what the prosecution was raising, because it wasn't unique to you. They've used almost the same blueprint for almost every witness that has taken the stance thus far, and we've only had 4 witnesses, 3 of them who dealt with the issues that you deal with, which are press freedom, and potentially you might be able to include the political opinions aspect of the case. And I wondered how you felt about how they were invoking the federal rules of prosecution as if that's somehow evidence that there wouldn't be political bias within the Justice Department. I thought that was rather absurd because those are just guidelines that are out there for prosecutors to follow. We've also seen them using the indictment as evidence, even though we know as journalists that we are not supposed to take indictments at face value because those are not examples of evidence. And, thirdly, along these same lines, I would say, how did you feel about this sort of pickle they were trying to put you in of being unbiased, quote unquote, unbiased, where they were trying to trap you into feeling like you weren't following the rules of the court in presenting your evidence because you weren't incorporating the prosecution's line of reasoning into your answers. Because I would point out that, if we're really focused on being unbiased, it's not like the prosecutor is going above and beyond to factor in the evidence or the realities and facts that are within the defense's case. And so I think it should go both ways. That if defense witnesses are expected to be unbiased, then the prosecutor in presenting their questions should also factor in things that are provable and real within the defense's case.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, first of all, Kevin, it's great to see you. It's been a long time. And thank you so much for all your excellent coverage and CN's coverage too. I mean, it's been, this is unrelated to your question, but it's been, fairly depressing to see the lack of mainstream coverage in this case, especially after all of the major newspapers in the United States, talked about when these charges came down, how what a clear and present danger to the First Amendment these charges were. Yet we've seen, almost zero mainstream coverage. So, thank you for carrying that flag for everybody. The reason I was able to follow the first few days of testimony before mine, again, I wasn't allowed a video link even as a witness, was because I was able to follow your tweets. But back to your question, the biased question was quite humorous in my mind. First of all, I was an expert witness for the defense. Obviously, my opinions were going to gel with theirs. Certainly, I made those opinions based on the facts in the case. But they were at one point, questioning me about the fact that I have an organization that advocates for press freedom, and because of that, I am somehow biased, or that I may be biased because I myself might be worried about prosecution if this case goes forward, because I talked about in the courtroom how I myself have called for documents to be leaked. So I thought that was quite absurd, and they seemed to give up on that angle after about 5 minutes, because I think they saw that it was going nowhere. But interesting thing that they're doing, it seems, with all the witnesses, is trying to go back in time and talk about what like the Guardian and the New York Times editors were saying about WikiLeaks at the time. And certainly the Guardian, some of the Guardian editors and some of the New York Times editors didn't get along with Julian Assange, and at the time, at least in some cases, criticized their editorial judgment. So the prosecutor, for example, made me read back a joint statement that these newspapers made around the time that the informants' names got released. And that's all well and good. They're allowed to do that. But I also think it was quite misleading. I mean, they were essentially, again, trying to change the question before the court. They were saying that the New York Times thought that Julian Assange was being irresponsible, but the U.S. government doesn't get to decide who's a responsible journalist and who is not. And what the prosecutor, conveniently left out was that all these newspapers that made this statement at the time have also made statements in the past year saying how dangerous this prosecution would be to them as journalists, and how they were, vehemently opposed to it. And so I made sure to point that out to the prosecution, right after he made me read this statement.
Alexander, please.
Yes, I mean, I've got actually a fairly simple point. First of all, can I just say, Trevor, I didn't see your evidence. I don't have a link, but everything I read about it suggests to me that you gave your evidence exceptionally well, and you did not let Lewis shake you, which is what he seems to be trying to do. But it seems to me that the fundamental problem that Lewis has is that they have to try to argue that Assange in some way is not a journalist, but they can't really say why. They can't say what it is about him that means that he is not a journalist. So they're having all these problems. They're struggling to reconcile all the various allegations that they're making about him. They have these various indictments. They say different things. They have to go outside these indictments and bring in press statements and things that Mr. Kronberg said, and things about, irresponsible actions that he might or might not have committed. Because ultimately, if he is a journalist, then this whole thing, this whole case becomes, for them, extremely difficult. Now, that is my impression of it. So it's and this attempt to try and get away from the fact, the acceptance that he is a journalist, and their inability to acknowledge that if he is a journalist, he has done nothing which is either illegal and certainly not anything that he should be extradited for.
Yeah, well, thank you for that, first of all. But yeah, so this was definitely kind of one of their main tactics. Like I said, they made me read the Justice Department press release, which I told them I thought was essentially meaningless. But my point to them was actually, I didn't want to get into an argument with them about whether I thought Julian Assange was a journalist or not, because I think that's actually besides the point. It actually doesn't matter if the Justice Department or anybody else considers Julian Assange a quote unquote journalist. What we do know for a fact was that he was engaging in journalistic activities in the actions that he is charged for. And really, that's all that matters, because, the First Amendment, has a clause in it that guarantees press freedoms, but it doesn't say we guarantee press freedoms for full-time journalists who are issued a press pass by the U.S. government. It says we guarantee these rights to everybody. And so that means whether you're a full-time journalist who works at the New York Times, whether you are a live streamer on the street who's never been employed by a news outlet before in your life, or going all the way back to the founding of the country, the anonymous pamphleteers that were so influential back in the 17 and 1800s. And so they're again trying to hide the ball here. They're trying to pretend that if Julian Assange doesn't fit within this job description, then he doesn't get the rights that other journalists do. And it's my opinion, and the opinion of many others, that that's just not how the Constitution works. And it was funny to me to see that in other testimony, it looked like they were trying to catch the witnesses in not understanding how the indictment works. Where with me, they were like, "Oh, actually, ignore the indictment and focus on this other stuff." It was the other amusing part was that they completely ignored a big section of the charges. They didn't want to talk about the what was in my expert testimony, which was a long explanation of how journalists are always interacting with sources. Journalists don't normally, certainly sometimes it happens, but you don't have documents magically dropped off on your doorstep in a neat little pile where you can write your whole story without ever talking to anybody else ever again. What happens is somebody gives you documents, you go back to them for more information, you ask for clarification, you potentially ask for more documents. You then go to other sources to try to corroborate this. You ask them, is this true? The source may tell you, yes, it is true, or they may say, no, actually, this is how it works, I'll tell you. Those sources might give journalists more documents. That's just how journalists work. Of course, journalists are talking to sources all the time. And what the U.S. government is doing is saying that Julian Assange was engaged in conspiracy by doing exactly this. And so they didn't want to talk about that at all. They just left those charges, completely alone, even though that was basically the entire basis for my expert testimony. So again, I just think what they are trying to do is hide the actual nature of their case here. And, we still have a lot of witnesses to go. So I hope they're not successful. But they're also adept at their game. So we'll see how this goes.
Elizabeth.
Yeah, Trevor, I'd like to ask you about, just briefly, about how you see this case moving forward. Do you have any hope for a successful defense?
I think, to be honest, it's an uphill battle. I can't say that I'm optimistic. But I do know that the defense team is incredibly capable and competent. They have expert witnesses coming up with all sorts of levels of expertise. I'm particularly excited for Daniel Ellsberg's testimony, which should be happening hopefully in the next week or two. I'm not sure if it had to get rescheduled, and I'm not sure exactly what day it's on. But I think that could be incredibly powerful. But the important part is that the defense, I think, or the legal team is doing a very comprehensive job, and that's incredibly important because they need to get all the evidence kind of on the record in this trial period for down the road for the appeals, because they're not going to be able to bring in new evidence in the appeals, and I think. And I'm just speaking generally here. I can't claim to be an expert in how the UK court system works, but if we take the US for example, it's sometimes hard for lower level judges to make decisions of this magnitude where they end up going against the government, and those decisions often come in the appeals courts or the highest court. In the UK. And so, it's certainly possible that Julian Assange can win now, but I think, he has several appeals available to him. And that may ultimately be where hopefully he ends up victorious.
Trevor, before we let you go, I wanted to ask you one question. There's been one challenge to the Espionage Act, constitutional challenge on the First Amendment, 1919 Schenck versus the US, and the Supreme Court upheld the Espionage Act as not being unconstitutional. So that Section E is still in there. Assange did certainly possess and disseminate classified information. Technically speaking, he committed a crime, but of course, everybody who reads a newspaper or has emailed the WikiLeaks release has also committed that crime. Do you anticipate another challenge at some point if he's brought to the United States, if he's convicted, so that this could become an even larger case, so that the Espionage Act can be once again challenged on the First Amendment grounds?
If this case actually gets to the US, and honestly, we might be years away from that, because Julian Assange has several appeals available to him, all the way from the UK to High Court to I think he can even go to the European Court of Appeals, or the European Human Rights Court. But if this case gets to the U.S., absolutely. I mean, I think it should go all the way to the Supreme Court because it is a foundational First Amendment issue. And the Supreme Court cases you mentioned 100 years ago, I actually don't even think those apply anymore. They haven't been explicitly overruled, but they've essentially been overruled implicitly by a series of Supreme Court rulings over the next 50 or 60 years. The last time that the Supreme Court weighed in on the Espionage Act was the Pentagon Papers case, and they weren't deciding this exact issue. They were talking about censorship versus prosecution. But if you go back and read some of those judges' opinions, I mean, it's pretty clear that many of the judges then thought that this law was unconstitutional. And certainly, this is also why the government has never brought these these charges before. The government knows that this law is unconstitutional. The government lawyers know that. That's why, in my testimony, I brought up half a dozen times that reporters have been threatened with prosecution under the Espionage Act, but the government never follows through. They want to be able to use those threats, but they never actually want to do it because they know that the statute is going to be struck down. And you know, this is a combination of the Trump administration, you know, not caring about potential constitutional issues or those norms that have been established for decades, and the fact that they have a rather unpopular defendant that's unpopular with both political parties that they think they could potentially squeeze through without that type of scrutiny that would normally happen if this was a reporter for the New York Times. But so that's a long way of saying that this is would absolutely be a major case that would potentially go all the way to the Supreme Court if it was in the United States. I do think we're years away from that happening. And even when it gets to the U.S., it would take years to get to the Supreme Court. But I'm hoping that it doesn't get that far, but we'll see.
Can you stick around for another question or two?
Yeah, I got time for one more.
Kevin, I'll give you another crack, please. Thanks.
Well, so, you know, Trevor, you've been tracking this very closely through your organization. I know you go back 10 years. I'm wondering if you want to comment on something who I know was your mentor, James Goodall, when you were going through law school. I know you got to work for him. And he's made a very salient point, I believe, about how they're prosecuting this. They want to say that he is able to be prosecuted under the Espionage Act while not granting him the First Amendment rights protections that would come from being prosecuted under that act. And I think that's an important point to make here. He also, in a conversation I had with him, had a comment about what happened with this case that came through the Southern District of New York. John Kodal ruled in a case involving the Democratic National Committee that it is protected under the First Amendment to publish hacked materials. The DNC had challenged, had argued that WikiLeaks had committed some kind of an attack, or I guess it was defamation or slander against the DNC by publishing the Podesta emails. And so it's my view that that becomes kind of a controlling kind of law, potentially, that has some relevance to the defense if they had a trial here in the United States. Do you have any comment on this dynamic here of the case, how the First Amendment interacts with the Espionage Act?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think a few people have made the remark, like Mike Pompeo, for example, the Trump Secretary of State, that Julian Assange doesn't have First Amendment rights because he's not a U.S. citizen. You know, Mike Pompeo clearly has no idea how the law works. That's just not true. If you are being prosecuted in the U.S., you have First Amendment rights, full stop. It doesn't matter where you're from or who you are or where you were born. And, you know, that's not even in dispute. You know, there's clear Supreme Court precedent on this case. The U.S. government isn't even going to attempt to make that argument. At least I don't think that they're that stupid. But you're right. So, you know, this is actually 10 years ago, I got to spend a few years working for James Goodall. So James Goodall is the former general counsel of the New York Times. He was actually their general counsel when the Pentagon Papers case happened. You know, he has been one of the staunch advocates for the right of WikiLeaks to publish this information, and has talked about for a long time for how this case threatens the rights of journalists, even though journalists, a lot of journalists, I should say, dislike Julian Assange or, you know, find his tactics, you know, unsavory. It doesn't matter in this case. You know, the current general counsel for the New York Times, or associate general counsel, David McCraw, has made this exact point. He has said that there is, even if you, you know, find Julian Assange distasteful, or can talk about the differences between the New York Times and WikiLeaks, under the law, there is no difference. And that's what we're worried about here. The way that the Espionage Act is written, it doesn't carve out an exception for certain journalists. It is applied to everybody equally. And I made this point in the court. I was essentially said that, you know, not only would every reporter who worked on these documents essentially be guilty, But every person, even in this courtroom, who reads these documents, because they physically have them in their hand, they are obtaining these documents. If you take the newspaper and you hand it to your friend to say, hey, check out this story, or you're on Twitter and you post a link, that means that you're also committing a crime by transmitting them. It is just an incredibly, incredibly broad law. And again, this is exactly why the U.S. government has never attempted to go after a private person under this law before, is because, you know, you look at it for 5 minutes and it's absurd. And of course, a judge would hopefully find it unconstitutional, you know, but here we have the U.S. government trying it anyways.
Stefania and Alexander, I'd like to give you both another opportunity.
Well,
But
I mean,
yeah. Please.
No,
Alexander,
Stefania, you go
ahead.
first. Go.
No, first you.
Okay. Well, I think the way I would describe my mood after the first week is perhaps not optimistic, but actually more hopeful. Can I just explain one thing, though, about the appeal process? If this loses at this level, this first instance level, he has a right of appeal to the High Court, and that will be a very long, very prolonged, very, you know, powerful hearing with probably several High Court judges, members of the judiciary. It would be an important hearing. The next step up is to the Supreme Court of the United Kingdom. I think that the European Court of Human Rights is too remote unless the Supreme Court itself decides to refer parts of the case to the European Court of Human Rights, which it might very well do. So we are looking at an appeal process. It will be very strong. I think that, as I said, he's got many more grounds of appeal now than it looked to me as if he might have a while back, because I don't think that the Crown and the US authorities are responding to the points that are being made very well. I don't think they really have a clear idea of how they're going to get to that point of being able to establish that there is a proper case upon which he can be extradited upon on these indictments. Now, I was not in the court. I haven't seen, you know, the body language of all the people involved. I haven't heard the tone of the judge. I can't speak about that. But going back to those decisions which the judge made on the first day of last week, I do get the sense that she herself, Maurizi, is starting to sense that this thing isn't going entirely according to plan. I think a decision to refuse a postponement for the defense to respond in more detail to this new superseding indictment was interesting. And I think a decision to restrict even further the degree of reporting of this case was also interesting. And of course, it suggests to me that, as I said, she feels that this thing is slipping out of control and doesn't also know quite how to proceed. I just wanted to say also one very last thing, which is that trying to argue that the whole case now is about disclosure of the identities of informants, not only is contrary to what the indictments say, it looks to me, frankly, desperate. I cannot imagine that anybody who is aware of these proceedings, including Maurizi, who's the judge, and certainly not the High Court judges who will consider this, will believe that. And I will also say that I think not only will they not believe that, but the very fact that Lewis is making comments like that shows that he too understands that this isn't going according to plan. So, as I said, hopeful, not optimistic, good grounds for appeal.
So, as for me, I completely agree with Alexander, with Trevor, that I agree that the defense is doing well and the US is not doing well at all. They are criminalizing journalism. They struggled with this case because they realized that it's very, very difficult to characterize the WikiLeaks and Julian Assange work as different from what we do all the time as journalists. At the same time, let me tell you that based on my experience, 5 years experience in dealing, trying to get the documents about this case using the Freedom of Information Act and litigating my Freedom of Information Act in Sweden, UK, US, Australia for the last 5 years, I'm not optimistic about the UK courts because I have seen how the UK authorities have behaved in this case, having a look, reading the Swedish documents. So, I mean, I got these documents, and these documents are about not just about the Swedish prosecution authority, but also about the Crown Prosecution Service, which is the very same agency in charge of this extradition case. So the Crown Prosecution Service was the agency in charge of cooperating with Sweden about the Swedish case, assisting their prosecution, and it's the very same agency in charge of this US prosecution. So I know, due to this work, how the Crown prosecution behaved in this case, and I'm not optimistic at all, because I have seen how they behaved in the Swedish case. I have seen the pressure on the Swedish prosecutors to have Julian Assange in London in this kind of quagmire for the last 9 years, putting pressure on the Swedish prosecutor not to go to London to question him, not to drop the case, when back in 2013, the Swedish prosecutors were considering to drop the case, and the UK prosecution service was telling them, don't you dare get cold feet. And I know how they were telling to the Swedish prosecutor, don't believe this case is just an extradition case like any other. So based on this, based on the fact that the Crown Prosecution Service destroyed the documents, even if the case was still ongoing, still very controversial and high profile, the Crown Prosecution Service destroyed the documents about this case while still ongoing. And to this day, I'm still fighting to get any explanation why these documents were destroyed. We are still at the tribunal asking for official information of when they were destroyed, what these documents contained, how many and why they were destroyed. So I'm not optimistic about the UK courts. I don't know what happened next. I don't know whether this case will basically will go to the European Court of Human Rights, but I'm not optimistic about the UK tribunals and courts, unfortunately, based on this work on the documents, official documents, which have allowed to reconstruct the case factually, and basically, I'm not optimistic it will have any fair treatment, unfortunately.
Kevin, would you like to ask another question? Trevor, as long as he can hang out here.
Well, I suppose my question would be, I understand this case mostly because of my coverage of Chelsea Manning. And to me, it seemed like what the United States government was going to be bringing was very nearly a carbon copy of the case against Chelsea Manning, and that they were just going to shift it over and say, oh, it was actually the publisher who did these crimes. And that's, to me, just seemed a very, and I'm oversimplifying, but it seemed like that was kind of what we could say if we were trying to help people understand what was happening, and to maybe communicate why it is so alarming, because we haven't made that leap before to go from going after the source. But there's a couple things I think of as I listen to everyone talk about all of this, which is one, you talking about how their concept of the Espionage Act reminds me of what has been written about with how the documents were blocked from access by any federal government employees when they were published. How the Library of Congress and the National Archives and the Pentagon set up ways in which they couldn't access. It's written about by Julian Assange in the introduction to the book that was published about the diplomatic cables, that in fact, during Chelsea Manning's case, there was a filter on the emails that was pulling out anything related to WikiLeaks. So you had the prosecution that was completely in the dark on some aspects of the case because it was going into a spam folder. And so my question to you is, with this new superseding indictment that we see, this fresh extradition request, as it morphs away from what we understand as the core of these allegations, if we are to believe that that's where it is headed, I mean, the defense certainly feels like they're trying to move this away from Chelsea Manning's actions to other actions that are far lesser known. And that's my question to you is, how do you feel we should grapple with this? Is this bait that we shouldn't take? Or as we take this seriously and they start to emphasize alleged hacking or conspiracy to engage in hacking, how do we brush up our work in defending freedom of the press so that we defend against those more general allegations?
Yeah, it's a really good question because, in the superseding indictment, it's I'm not an expert in criminal law, but it's the first superseding indictment I've seen where they didn't actually add any new charges. And that might have been because of the extradition rules. They're not allowed to, or something like that. But the only thing that they did do was add a bunch of background that had nothing to do with almost all of the charges except for one. And this background is essentially trying to paint Julian Assange as some sort of hacker. It was actually interesting to me. I thought that they were going to use that to try to totally shift the case. Because, when you look at the Chelsea Manning stuff, this is kind of classic journalistic behavior. They never asked me any question about anything beyond strictly the Chelsea Manning interactions, which I was rather surprised by. I think that anybody covering this case should just keep their eye on the ball and the actual charges in the indictment rather than kind of this background color, which really has almost nothing to do with every charge except maybe arguably one. So the charges related to the Chelsea Manning disclosures remain exactly the same. They're the ones that I described earlier, involving the receipt of classified documents, the talking to a source who's giving them classified documents, and the publishing of them. All activities that of course journalists engage in all the time. So I think the government is going to try a bunch of tactics to kind of hide the ball. With me, they were trying to ignore some of the counts. Maybe down the road, they're going to focus on all this background information while not focusing on any of the counts. It's hard to say, but I think the real upshot from the superseding indictment is that none of the counts have changed. So all the problems that everybody said existed a year ago still exist, and that's, I think, what I'm most worried about. Unfortunately, I have to take off now, but thanks so much for having me here. It was a great discussion, and hopefully I can come back soon.
Well, Trevor, 15 minutes turned into 45, and we're really grateful for that. Thank you so much again. And again, it's great to talk to you about your testimony.
Great. Thanks so much. Take care.
Bye-bye. We have someone who's asked to join our show, and we said yes. I don't know if he's in yet, but it's Kim Dotcom, the computer entrepreneur and friend of WikiLeaks and Julian Assange. And Kim was obviously watching this live webcast and wants to join in. Is he in yet, Kathy? Hello, Kim. Can you hear me? All right.
Yes, I can hear you. How are you, Joe?
Oh, very good, Kim. Good to hear you. Now we want to see you because we only see.
I don't have a camera on this PC because, they're watching.
Oh, this is a clandestine interview. That's fine. We understand. Well, what did you make of the first week, Kim?
I followed the entire hearing, I've been reading all the documents, all the indictments, superseding indictments, and a lot of the evidence that was presented. So I'm pretty much up to date on what's happening. I find the developments in the court quite interesting. The judge is very bad at hiding her bias, and I think it is pretty clear to any observer that what's happening in the court is not really how a fair trial looks like. Now, here's one thing that I think everyone is missing, and I haven't seen it in any of the articles that were written by the media and even the observers in the court. And that's what I would like to point out. I think what the US is attempting here is not actually achieve the extradition. They know they're going to fail with this. I can say this because I know how the DOJ operates. I've been fighting them for 9 years. Their playbook is open to me. I understand how they operate. A decision was made in the United States government to take Julian Assange out of play and to punish him by process, meaning using this process of extradition to have him silenced for the many years that it will take to run its course. We heard earlier it will go through the district court, it will then go to the high court, and then potentially to the Supreme Court. We are talking about a minimum of 3 to 4 years before we even reach the Supreme Court. And then we probably have to wait another year for a decision from the Supreme Court. So this whole process is designed to keep him locked up and to silence him. The best strategy that the defense team of Julian Assange can apply to the strategy is the best counter strategy is to get a new bail hearing, argue for a bail with new facts. For example, that the legal team has a private facility where Julian can be under 24/7 guard, but with access to his lawyers, with access to computers, to the internet, to the mobile phone, maybe even with his family living with him. There's nothing that speaks against that. And of course, the US is going to say, well, he skipped bail before, but surprise, surprise, he was completely right about his reasons, which has now been confirmed by this indictment and this extradition request. So he had legitimate concerns about his safety, and for that reason was seeking asylum. Now, I believe all of this in combination with the fact that his health is poor, that a private security arrangement could be made, would allow for a new bail hearing. And once you have that bail hearing, I believe the district court is going to refuse, but then you can fast track the appeal process. The bail matter will be heard much faster by the higher courts than the extradition matter. So if they can make a compelling case to give Julian bail, he may be in front of the Supreme Court within a year, and that way his legal team can secure his freedom. That is the number one strategy that they have to focus on, because while he is locked up in Belmarsh and is going through this entire process, the US has already won. They have achieved their goal of silencing Julian Assange. So the strategy has to shift in parallel to securing his freedom. And that can be done, I think, on a fast track with urgent appeals. After the district court says no, which I'm convinced it will, you can then move straight to the high court. And I think the more senior the judges are, the less dependent they are on the favor of the government. This judge that is currently hearing it will not want to upset her future plans and rise through the ranks. But the more senior judges that have already reached their goals in their careers, they may be looking at this and actually saying, okay, look, there are some really compelling arguments here why he should have bail. He's no threat to the public or anyone really. There's no reason to keep him locked up, especially if there are some good security arrangement that make the court feel like he's not going to run away. And by the way, nowhere would be safe for Julian Assange. There's no place in the world where he could run if he skipped bail. Every country, will be putting him through the same process and try and extradite him. So, why I wanted to come on is to raise this issue, because at the moment, as it stands, the US has already accomplished what their goal was with this extradition proceeding. The Obama administration and their lawyers and their DOJ decided, and rightfully so, will never win this in any court because, of course, Julian is a journalist. He's covered by the constitutional protections, and that's why they decided not to go ahead. What has changed since then? Now we have a Trump administration. President Trump, of course, was attacked with the Russia story, with the Mueller investigation, and later the impeachment. What Trump really wanted Julian Assange to do is to bail him out by saying who his source was. That's why Trump sent an envoy to the embassy in London, to the Ecuadorian embassy, to try and make a bargain. And Julian refused and said, I'm not going to give up my source or any evidence about this. And the envoy carried that message back to Trump. And that is when things turned sour. And that is when he instructed his attorney general to now brutally go after Julian, get him out of the embassy, and start the extradition proceedings. It's a very personal matter for Trump. And of course, it is a political case. Of course, Julian is a journalist. But the number one strategy right now has to be to get him out of jail, because his health is deteriorating. His mind is getting weaker and weaker, being in the conditions that he is within the jail. The number one priority has to be to get him out. And that's all I wanted to say, guys.
Well, thank you, Kim. Stefania has to leave, so I want to give her the floor. But first, I wanted to ask a quick question of Alexander about the fact is that Maurizi already denied him bail. Can he apply? Can his lawyers apply again?
Well, in theory, they can. I mean, you can always apply for bail, but you have to show that there's been a fundamental change of circumstances which would justify granting bail after it's been refused. Now, can I just say, he should absolutely have been granted bail. I mean, I think it's an absolute disgrace that he was never granted bail. I don't think there's any basis, any real grounds for refusing it. But I cannot see Maurizi changing her mind about that. I don't think she will grant bail. And I'm afraid that appealing that decision, Maurizi's decision to refuse bail, to the High Court will probably take longer than going through these proceedings that we're going through at the moment, and then going from those proceedings to the High Court. I'm not convinced it would save time. And I'm afraid I'm not convinced it would succeed either, because the High Court would probably be very unwilling to interfere with a decision by a district judge, which could be represented as what the courts in England call a case management decision. So it's disgraceful he wasn't awarded bail. I am frankly doubtful that he can be awarded bail at the moment. After these proceedings are over in the magistrates' court, When it goes on appeal to the High Court, then of course a further application for bail can be made. But then of course the problem is, if Maurizi has found against him and says he should be extradited, then he's got the problem when he goes to the High Court. They will say, well, you know, he's actually been he's ripe for extradition, and therefore it becomes even less appropriate to grant him bail. But I think they probably will apply for bail at that stage, but not now. That's my own assessment of it.
Let me just quickly respond to that.
Yeah.
Alexander, nice to meet you, by the way.
Very.
So I've set the precedent with this in New Zealand. We are also Commonwealth law, as you know. I applied for bail 3 times and I was rejected 3 times, and I got it at the 4th time. I went from the district court to the High Court, and ultimately I secured bail. All the defense needs to show that there's a change of circumstances. They can create these circumstances by saying, we can ensure in a private facility that he will be monitored 24 hours. He doesn't have to be in this prison. And plus, now that the defense has started revealing some of their legal arguments, they can renew the request for bail, saying, look, there's really no grounds here. He is obviously a journalist. The High Court itself has confirmed that in one of its judgments earlier in Julian's case. Plus, the change of circumstance is also that his health is deteriorating. We have many doctors that have now written reports about his health and how poor it is, and that he can't even follow the hearing properly, that he has no chance to commute with talk with his lawyers. So the new circumstances can, of course, be created by his legal team and used to apply for bail. And then, of course, once Maurizi refuses it, this can be appealed, and it can be an urgent appeal. It doesn't have to take as long as an appeal for an extradition hearing would take, because it's a very narrow legal matter, and the urgency is based on his health and the very long time that it will take for this hearing to actually go through the courts. And it is unjust to have someone who is defending themselves be in jail for the next 3 to 5 years while this plays out in court. And the legal team really needs to aggressively attack the strategy, keeping him locked up and silencing him, because the longer he is locked up, the more likely it is that his health will be damaged beyond repair, that he may even consider suicide, and his mind just going bust. So his lawyers really need to focus on securing his freedom. And I have done it, and that's why I know how the strategy works, because I've done it myself. They wanted to keep me in jail. They fought really hard, and they said that I would be the biggest flight risk. And here I am, 9 years later. I didn't leave. I'm still here defending myself. So if it worked for me, it can work for Julian.
Well, first of all, congratulations on that. I'm going to just make 2 observations. Firstly, unfortunately, we have a more conservative legal culture in Britain than they do in New Zealand. New Zealand has a much more libertarian legal culture than we do. And secondly, I have to say that I think that persuading the High Court that there has been a change of circumstances in this situation is going to be very difficult. And I would love to see him out of prison. I don't think he should be in detention at all. I think it is a disgrace and a shame on Britain and on our legal system that he has been held in, not just in detention, but in Belmarsh of all places. I mean, I think that is completely outrageous, and that he's been separated from his family. But I can see problems, and I hope the legal team can find a way around them, but I can understand why they may judge, given what I've said about the legal culture here, that it may be better at this time to focus on the present proceedings. Whereas I said, I think they're making ground. And hopefully those won't be prolonged for very long. And when it goes to the High Court, they can make a renewed application for bail there with perhaps a reasonable prospect of success.
Let me say one last thing before I take off. I hear you. This is a very high profile case. You know, senior judges are always interested in getting involved in very high profile cases. That alone, when the appeal request arrives at the High Court, may trigger whoever is, the judge at the time making the decision if the appeal should be heard. It may make it work. Simply that this is a high-profile case. The High Court can engage in it early on. There may be people sitting in the High Court right now who are following the proceedings because it is a high-profile case and shaking their head about how the judicial system of the UK is currently viewed internationally. You know, this is a very important case, and people are looking at it. And the High Court may want to weigh in on if Julian Assange should have bail or not, because it is a global media case of very high interest. I think the judges there will be tempted to hear an appeal for bail.
Well, certainly the High Court judges are going to take this case very seriously when it comes to them. And what you said, that they are conscious of what is being said about the legal system in Britain around the world, is completely true. And by all means, be aware that they do follow what people like us on these kind of programs say about this. This is why what we do is actually very important in a case like this.
Stefania, you'd like to go say something before you have to leave?
Yes. So first of all, I'm not a lawyer, so I'm unable to have an informed opinion on whether he can get bail or he cannot get bail. I'm very skeptical based on the fact that he was even denied the permission to get out of the glass wall. So I'm very skeptical about this. I'm very skeptical based on the documents I have read from my Freedom of Information Act. You have to realize that when he was appealing against the extradition, he was fighting the extradition to Sweden, the UK authorities and the Swedish authorities were basically, and the UK authorities, Swedish authorities were considering whether they could extradite immediately Julian Assange to Sweden without allowing him to appeal to the European Court of Human Rights. So this is the kind of environment, the kind of situation with a very conservative and hostile legal system and in the UK. And I want to tell you that while fighting my Freedom of Information Act case, my lawyers and I basically got a statement from the Crown Prosecution Court, the Crown Prosecution Service, which basically is the very same agency in charge of the US extradition case. And this agency basically made clear that they are ready to extradite him as a criminal like any other. So I'm not optimistic about their attitude towards this extradition. They were very, very clear that they are not giving this extradition a different look as they are extraditing a drug dealer, a mafia killer, and so on. So, for example, they argue that if I got any documents about the UK and US correspondence, that might tip off Julian Assange because they had to extradite him in case those documents were about an extradition. So they are very, very reluctant to look at this case as freedom of the press case. they look at this extradition, the UK authorities and the UK judges are looking at this extradition as an extradition like any other, as if they are extraditing a criminal like any other, mafia killer, a drug dealer. And this makes me very, very concerned. This makes me very, very concerned because this is the most important case about journalism and about the possibility for us to reveal war crimes and torture. So we cannot afford to lose this case because the consequences will be gigantic.
Yes, Kevin, you want to weigh in?
Yeah, I mean, something that's been striking to me that hasn't exactly come up yet. And I mean, well, one, if we don't lose you, Stefania, before I finish, I'm interested in how you feel about how this precedent against Julian Assange would impact you being a global journalist, because in fact, you fit the criteria of people under threat much more than myself because I am a US citizen. But in this case, we see a precedent being set to go after anyone outside the US who is not a US citizen, who has obtained US classified information or who has US secrets. And it would seem to be that they would like to use the world as a battlefield, as they have for the last 15 to 20 years asserted the right to engage in any US military operations around the world, that now they would also like to assert the right to be able to control the flow of information and come after any journalist who publishes material that the US government would oppose. But with that, I also point out that this wholesale criminalization of this, or this contempt of the institution of political asylum, is hugely troubling to me. I can't understand how, well, I suppose I can understand from a political science perspective, from someone who analyzes power and how it works, it is possible to understand. But I think as just a average human being, I think we should remain baffled and aghast that this judge allows these arguments for bail to persist, where you treat Julian Assange as if he has committed a crime by seeking political asylum. Because when you break down what the argument is for keeping him in jail, this idea that he would flee these charges is that he would flee to another embassy and would seek asylum from someone who would, and potentially it could be France, it could be Spain, it could be Germany, it could be any country in Europe at this moment that has politicians that are taking an interest in this case.
Absolutely, Kevin. I mean, I completely agree. And, you have to realize that as a journalist who has worked on all these publications, on all these documents, I have published the very same documents, and I have done this for the last 10 years. So, I mean, I feel completely upset about the fact that I have never had any problem, and Julian had all sorts of problems. So it is completely unfair. It is completely, unacceptable, even not only professionally, but also ethically speaking. From an ethical point of view, I have published the very same documentation for the last 10 years, and I was never questioned. I was never put in prison, whereas he has never known freedom again. His health is basically collapsing. And what they are basically trying to do is also to break him down. It's very obvious. That's why also they keep him in prison. So, I mean, I really cannot accept this. I really cannot accept that if you publish documents revealing war crimes, and we know how many war crimes. I could tell you what they revealed about, for example, the Italian investigation on the CIA rendition of Abu Omar in Milan, how these documents finally allowed to reveal pressures on our ministers, and finally 6 justice ministers refused to forward the arrest warrant to the US, which is unbelievable. I mean, so if you publish these documents or reveal war crimes, there is no place to hide. This case basically is about the US is desperate to make this case that if you do this, if you mess up with us, there is no place to hide for you. You cannot hide in an embassy because sooner or later we will arrest you. You cannot escape the justice in any way. You cannot get asylum. The refugee status will not protect you. So this is very scary. I mean, there must be a place to hide if you are a journalist revealing secret documents exposing war crimes. And I absolutely want to work on this case because I want to find a place. And I want that this place is here in our society. Is not in prison, is not in arbitrary detention as Julian Assange, is not even in Russia as Snowden. I want that if you reveal these documents and if you publish these documents, then you have a place to be protected in our societies, because this is what democracy is. It must be safe to publish these documents and not to end up in prison, not to end up in Russia. That's why I'm fighting. I mean, as a journalist, you know.
Alexander, we have Kim still on the line.
Yeah, I'm still here.
Yeah, on the radio portion of our webcast.
I'm sorry, I
about
have to leave you. I'm sorry, I have to rush out.
Stefania, grazie tanto. Ci vediamo.
Thanks to you.
Fino alla prossima volta. Grazie.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Kim, you know, Stefania just brought up the war crimes, and we haven't even been talking about that. What was in these documents and how vital that is to this case. This is why this is happening. A journalist has published information that the US government did not want to get out. That's absolutely true. That's more than embarrassing. It's incriminating. And it's not just embarrassing. And they're going after him. And the public would be up in arms if the media actually presented it that way instead of taking the side of the state. Anybody could answer that.
I mean, there's a lot at stake here, you know. I mean, the US government was clearly embarrassed by the WikiLeaks releases. But when it comes to the war crimes that were shown in the releases and in the evidence that WikiLeaks put out for everyone to see, one has to remember that the US never signed up to the International Criminal Court. And for good reason, because they know how they operate in these wars, and that there are, of course, grounds for them to be prosecuted for war crimes. So this is really what this is. The US is, trying to attack anyone who is showing that these war crimes are taking place and that nothing is being done to prevent things like this from happening. I mean, we saw the video of collateral murder where the helicopter pilots were treating this whole thing like a video game, and they were all just hot on trying to kill people, you know. And this is just one video that we've seen. But this is commonplace. This is how the US military acts in war. And, for that reason, they are not part of the International Criminal Court, because people would be going to jail. Sanctions would be issued against the United States. So what Julian has done is basically the job of the International Criminal Court, showing this evidence and calling the US out as war criminals. And when you do something like that to an empire as powerful as the United States, that controls 25% of the global GDP, you are going to get in trouble. And if he wouldn't be in trouble right now, it would send the wrong message to everyone who's attempting to do something similar. So they really have no choice but to go after him and make an example of him to scare every other journalist, not just in the US, but globally, to ever attempt something like this again.
Well, I think raising the International Criminal Court is absolutely appropriate. We had that surface in the proceedings in the last week. So I just would briefly recap some of what happened when it was mentioned, because in the cross-examination of Clive Stafford Smith, the human rights attorney who was the legal director for Reprieve, he expressed his own belief that the US government might have grounds to target the lawyers for Julian Assange on the basis that they have used to target people who are officials in the International Criminal Court right now. We know that multiple officials in the ICC have been sanctioned by the Trump administration, that Mike Pompeo, as Secretary of State, fully supports this. And of course, he's been one of the most aggressive proponents of going after Julian Assange, and WikiLeaks calling it a hostile non-state intelligence agency. And so I think this is absolutely what we need to focus on, because on appeal in the ICC, we've seen this investigation be greenlit to examine the CIA and its activities in Afghanistan as far as it relates to torture and war crimes, to examine the Afghanistan government, to look at any militias and the Taliban and the way that they have carried out war as well, but to look at these forces that we have supported, the US coalition forces have supported, and how they've been engaged in torture and war crimes. And throughout these proceedings, we've heard evidence related to how these cables helped to stop the escalation of drone strikes in Pakistan, and how a high court ruled against allowing those, because they determined that those were war crimes actually in a court of law within Pakistan, and that Clive Stafford Smith had a role in making this possible. We know that there have been cases like Khalid al-Masri, who was abducted and kidnapped, a German citizen who was brought to the salt pit in Afghanistan and who suffered rendition and torture. And eventually his case went through the European Court of Human Rights, and he was granted damages against Macedonia for their role and involvement in this, and that WikiLeaks cables played a part in that. We know that if you go to Guantanamo Bay, that Clive Stafford Smith talked about the detainee assessment briefs and how it revealed the way in which there were only like 7 or 8 prisoners there who were relied on as informants, who formed the massive basis for making cases and fabricating cases against hundreds of detainees who were still being kept at Guantanamo Bay. I think this very much has to be the focus, and it is a key aspect of the legal team's case against Julian Assange to say that not only are they criminalizing and going after a journalist and targeting press freedom, but they are also targeting Julian Assange because he exposed US criminality.
Kevin, it's really extraordinary. You bringing all that back. When I was hearing that in the court, it struck me that this was something unusual to hear in a British court in the strong ally of the US, a long, detailed discussion of US prima facie evidence of US war crimes. Alexander, is that something unusual? Have you often?
It is extremely unusual, but it is not entirely unprecedented. I mean, we have had a whole succession of cases in Britain now involving war crimes, not so much by the US, but by the British military in Iraq and other places. And we've had decisions by the British courts which have gone against the British authorities and against the British military. None of the very top senior people have been implicated in them, but nonetheless, those kind of issues have been brought up in British courts. So yes, it's unusual. It is not completely unprecedented, and perhaps it will grow, and certainly in the High Court, where these sort of cases tend to end up, they become more common. I mean, to just give one very well-known example, which is about Britain, specifically what happened within the United Kingdom of Britain, there has been a very long history now in the British court system of cases relating to atrocities that were committed by the British military and the British security services in the conflict in Ireland. So, we need to understand that this is not quite as unusual as it used to be. And can I also say something? Of course, this case is all about the exposure of war crimes by the United States. Let us be under no illusions about this. This is why Julian Assange is in that dock in the Old Bailey. No other reason. They wouldn't be interested in extraditing him if it was just because he was involved in some hacking somewhere. That's not even, that question wouldn't even arise. This is what this whole case is about. And this is, of course, precisely what the Crown, the prosecution, the US authorities are trying to pretend is not the case. This is why they don't really want to talk about this. This is why they're coming up with all these other little issues which are are not really fundamental to the issues that are being discussed. This is why they're trying to draw away attention from what the indictments say. It's in a sense a sort of bait and switch exercise. It's what Trevor Timm was talking about, taking the eye off the ball. This is entirely about war crimes. It's about nothing else, ultimately. And this is what makes this ultimately a political trial. When you are involved in a political trial, how do you defend yourself? Well, there is precedent for this. We've seen this in the Rivonia trial, in the Leipzig trial, in many other trials of this nature. You have to pretend, in the good faith of the legal system, that you are caught up in, especially if it's a legally sophisticated system like the one in Britain. You pretend in its good faith, even if you don't believe in it, and you rely on the law. And that puts the judges ultimately on the defensive, because judges are people who are supposed to administer the law. And that, it seems to me, is what the defense team is very effectively doing.
Frankly, I was surprised that Baraitser let Clive Smith and Mark Summers go on and on about all these details. I've covered a trial in the US of some plowshares where they broke into a US Air Force base and put blood on a B-52 and all. And of course, during the trial, they wanted to give the political motives they had. And the judge wouldn't have a word of that. Did you break in? Did you damage government property? Dan Ellsberg tells the same story, frankly, that he could not put a political defense out there. Did you steal the classified documents? Yes or no? So I was surprised that Baraitser didn't say, forget all about this. We don't want to know all about this. That also leads me to the question I need to ask you, because Craig Murray wrote in his incredible account, and this is a man who I understand is not even allowed to bring a pen and paper into the courtroom, and yet he has a photographic memory to reproduce in great detail exactly what has happened. He writes that James Lewis is not behaving like a typical British prosecutor, that a British prosecutor is calm, controlled, and doesn't give any respect to the defense argument. Whereas as an American and watching American courts, it's the bulldog, the bully is what an American prosecutor is. Now he's being paid. Yes. He's being paid by the US government, Lewis. He's given, and I almost feel sorry for him, he's given a very weak case by the United States. Yeah. And he's up there during the US argument. Is he trying to play an American prosecutor on TV here? What is he actually doing? Is this under American instructions to behave this way? What do you think?
Well, can I just quickly say, I think the reason that Baraitser allowed all that evidence to be admitted goes back to what I said. I think she is becoming nervous because the case is slipping out of control. So she is worried about taking decisions which perhaps a few months ago, when the case was more under control, she would have made. But coming to Lewis, it is absolutely the case, as Craig Murray says, that in Britain, prosecutors are very restrained and very controlled, and it's almost like you don't come in with you come in with a rapier, not a cudgel. And by the way, that's the kind of approach that tends to work with British juries and with British judges. They don't like bullying tactics, and judges are supposed, by the way, to protect witnesses from bullying tactics. I think the reason Lewis is bullying witnesses is not because he's copying American court practice. I think it is because he has a very weak case indeed. And the only way he knows to shake the confidence of these very expert witnesses is precisely to bully them. But I come back to what I said at the beginning. I don't think that by doing that, he has actually shaken any of that evidence which those expert witnesses gave. Even Professor Feltzman, who was a bit shaken, I don't think I don't think in the end it really damaged the essence of the evidence that was given. So I just think the tactic is working. I think it's counterproductive. I think, on the contrary, it's giving some of the experts, like, who are perhaps more confident in dealing with this sort of thing and perhaps more experienced in dealing with American courtroom tactics, an opportunity to hit back, which is exactly what a witness like Trevor Timm, for example, was able to do.
Indeed. Well, this open discussion, if anybody wants to jump in.
I wanted to ask you, both of you, or all of you, if Kim, you want to jump in as well, how you think the government the prosecutors might reframe their narrative a little bit after Trevor so succinctly basically unraveled their entire narrative?
Well, let me answer this for you. I can tell you that the Crown lawyers representing the US are very uncomfortable with this hearing. And the Department of Justice and the US government are making a terrible mistake, because over the next few years, in this extradition context, we will hear this over and over again about US war crimes, what Julian Assange has actually released, and it's not going to have any positive effect for the United States. Yes, they have this single individual who they don't like locked up and silenced, but now everyone else is speaking for him. The relevance of his disclosures is now under the looking glass, and the whole world will hear more and more about it over and over again. So in a way, they are shooting themselves in the foot. And the performance of the Crown lawyers in this extradition hearing in the first week was absolutely poor. Trevor could easily disarm all their arguments. And it is, for me, as an observer, to see this, it reminds me so much of my case. I've really enjoyed my extradition hearings, pointing the fingers at all the lies from the DOJ and showing how they are not even fulfilling their duty of candor, which they also don't do in this proceeding so far, because the US has to disclose to the extradition court the weaknesses in their case. They have neither done that in the indictment nor in any of the submissions that they have made. They're not talking about how the previous administration decided not to prosecute Assange and try and extradite him, because the legal experts found that there's no basis for that. They have a duty to disclose that to the extradition court. That in itself is a point for appeal, and why the whole extradition process can fail, because there's obviously no candor here from the United States.
Absolutely. Excuse me. Actually, Kim, that issue came up repeatedly over the last couple of days, where Lewis was trying to say that Obama did not decide not to prosecute because they'd left the grand jury open. Why did they leave the grand jury open? Because they want to. One response was, I think it was from Feldstein, that perhaps they want to look at co-conspirators, or new evidence might come up. And in fact, the so-called new evidence that came up was from 2010 in this superseding indictment.
Yeah, but it's irrelevant what Lewis says, because officials from the previous DOJ have already admitted that they decided not to go after Julian. So it's on the record. It's not something that Lewis can wash, to go away. The DOJ officials from that time have admitted that already.
The Washington Post articles, that's right. There were two who resigned because they didn't want, from the Trump DOJ, because they did not want this prosecution to go forward. But he's trying to undermine that continuously by saying it's only a newspaper report. And by the way, why didn't you put Kronberg's memo into your expert report? You're not objective. It's pitiful to watch. The guy's such a weak hand he's been dealt.
Lewis is not having any fun. And just watching this whole thing, this is going to be the most embarrassing episode in his career, and also everyone else who's representing the US in that extradition proceeding. It's embarrassing, and if Julian was free right now, and that is why I made my initial point, we could actually have a lot of fun with this. Exposing the US over and over again at every instant of this extradition case. And the higher we get in the courts on appeal, the more interesting the matter becomes, the more the general media gets involved. So the US, like I said, is really shooting themselves in the foot, but it would only be fun if Julian was free and could contribute in his commentary and pointing these things out over and over again. What a beautiful gift the US has given us for bringing this extradition proceeding, because now we can over and over again point out their illegal activities. The only thing that is the downside here is that Julian is still in jail, and I think they can get him out within a year if they follow the same route that I have taken before. Applying for bail over and over again and appealing, and you may find a judge that says, yes, I agree with you, he should have bail. And once you have that, we can turn this whole thing into such a fun event exposing the US empire.
And that only works if you have the press really reporting that exposure. And unfortunately, we're not seeing the press cover this case as they should. We're trying to do our best, and the journalists we have on today are trying to do their best. But would you all comment, please, on the way in which the media has completely failed in its responsibility to report on this issue?
I think you put the word correctly, responsibility. They've completely failed in their responsibility to report this issue. I mean, not all of the press. I mean, the Consortium uses the press. I mean, it is reporting it. So, but, if we're talking about the big legacy media, the BBC, the Times, the Guardian, those sort of things, it's very, very, very sad and very troubling. No doubt they will say that they're hiding behind the various, sub judice rules, which actually don't apply. I mean, you can certainly cover a story like this. And it's, I think, a sign of two things. Firstly, obviously, the extent to which Julian Assange has been, his reputation has been trashed. And so he's seen by many people as somebody you don't want to get too close to. But I think ultimately what it shows, and we've discussed this before, I think in other places, and what Robert Parry, the great Robert Parry, often used to talk about, some parts of the media have got far too close to power. And they've forgotten what the role of the media ultimately is, which is to hold power in check. And unfortunately, that is a reality. And it's been exposed in a very distressing way in this case. And of course, it's one reason, I suspect, some sections of the media are actually hostile to Assange. So it's very terrible, but we mustn't think that because the big media aren't reporting this. I mean, obviously, it would have changed completely the dynamic of this case if the media had been reporting it. But if it doesn't mean that because the big media isn't reporting it, it can't be, it can't be reported, and what goes on in the court itself somehow, it's all inside a hermetic bubble and the world outside doesn't know. I mean, programs like this do make a difference. I worked for 12 years in the Royal Courts of Justice. I know for a fact that they do make a difference. So let's not give up our hope and say, because the media isn't exercising its responsibilities properly, this battle is lost. It's not lost at all. I think in the High Court, in the court, in the hearing, ground has been gained, and it's important that it's being reported as such by on forums like this one.
Yeah, and I would add that, alternative press and independent press are really leading on this case and have. And in the history of this WikiLeaks story, we've seen that if I go back to Chelsea Manning's court-martial, the people who were covering this extensively were independent journalists. It didn't come from the mass media. And in fact, it may be better off that you have people like us lead the way in the press in coverage, because there are people within these media institutions who do not understand it as well as we do. And in fact, I have an example that personally happened with me. I was invited on to a BBC radio program very early in the morning, and the host asked me about the fresh allegations that were included in the third indictment. And he said to me, "Aren't there 18 new allegations against Julian Assange?" And I said, "Well, no." And I brushed that off as just his slip of the tongue, and I didn't know where he was getting that. And I come to realize that the Sky News in the UK actually published in their headline that there were 18 new allegations in an indictment against Julian Assange. Is absolutely wrong. And as far as I know, I haven't seen a retraction of that entire story as their coverage for the case. It is completely misinformation. And it means that people aren't going to understand what is happening in this prosecution against Julian Assange. And so I would just tell people that if you feel like the New York Times isn't covering it, or the Washington Post or the Guardian isn't doing it extensively, if you go on to any social media platforms, or you just do a basic Google search, you can find our reporting at shadowproof.com. You can find Consortium News. You can find these other outlets that are actually paying attention, and you don't need the New York Times. In fact, I remember when I was doing the coverage for the Chelsea Manning court-martial that I forced the public editor then, Margaret Sullivan, to have the New York Times newspaper print a correction because they had reported the aiding the enemy charge argument against Chelsea Manning incorrectly. And so they are constantly getting this wrong, not only because they have a personal animus against Julian Assange, not only because they refuse to accept he's a journalist and treat him like a source or a whistleblower, which is entirely incorrect, but because they also are not doing diligent work on this matter. They are much more interested in other distracting cases or stories that are being put to them by U.S. government officials. They are much more they're into these shiny objects that are being dangled before their faces, like for example, left-wing websites are being approached by alleged Russian trolls and things of that nature, and they aren't digging into this most critical case, and it falls on us to take the lead.
Well, that's excellent, Kevin, and very good work you did with the New York Times. And speaking of the New York Times, they're doing exactly what I thought they would do. They had a staff-written report for the opening of this hearing, and they'll have one at the end. And if anything extraordinary happens, they're going to use AP. And of course, the outbursts, we didn't bring that up. The outbursts, the press has been going on about the outbursts, plural, of Julian Assange when he only once spoke up in court. So that was the tabloid kind of drama that they saw. But Alexander, the US press and the Washington Post has done the same. They just ran a FAQ the first day, and an interview and a story, a feature about Feldstein, our Feldstein, because he comes from the University of Maryland, which is in the readership area of the Washington Post. What about the British press, the Times? Are there any reporters that are there every day? We only know, I think, of one that's on the list of remote. Isn't that right? I think only from the Times. How is the British press covering this? Is it also
well, then, I mean, if you're talking about the big, legacy media, basically they're not covering it. I mean, it's exactly the same, by the way. I mean, more attention was given to this one outburst that Julian Assange made than to everything else that has happened over the course of this entire hearing. I mean, it is a complete trivialization of this enormously important case. I'm going to say something else, which is, unfortunately, we do not have quite the wealth of independent media in Britain that you now have in the United States. There's media outlets like the Canary, for example, which are very good, and they're growing in traction. But we don't yet have this culture that you have in the United States of, lots of independent voices that are able to speak out. So as a result, this case has not gained in Britain, where it is happening, and where this tremendous, cruelty to this man. I mean, Kim Dotcom was talking about, the fact that he's not able to participate actively in his case and the fact that he's in prison. We must not ignore the cruelty of that. That hasn't yet, I think, broken through to the British public in the way that it should, because it simply isn't being reported here. We also have this problem that in Britain, of course, political oxygen over the last year, so much of political oxygen was taken up with the Brexit battle. And this has been the all-consuming, all-dominating story around which everything was framed. And of course, the Julian Assange case, which is so important, wasn't, I think, given anywhere near the attention that it should have been.
And following up on that, just focusing on the public perception of this case, in the US, it seems as if on the right, there's a false perception that this is all about Russiagate, that Trump's bringing Assange over to disprove Russiagate. And then on the left, you have people basically forgetting that this is about 2010. They still kind of are angry at Assange about Russiagate, but they ignore the fact that it's the Trump administration that is prosecuting Assange. It's a really sad situation, and obviously that's impacted by the media. But is there something similar like that in the public perception in the UK?
It is very similar. Of course, I mean, the sex allegations did an enormous amount of damage. And I mean, if you go now, I mean, my wife, Catherine, who, teaches students, she's found it very difficult to get students, for example, to take an interest in this case, because they still believe that they still have this idea that there are these sex allegations, and this has done enormous damage to him. But if you talk to sort of people who are perhaps a stage removed from that, you talk about liberal people in academia, they blame Julian Assange for the fact that Donald Trump is president of the United States. They think that he had something to do with that. I mean, that is an absurd and completely wrong perspective on this whole thing. And of course, it is completely short-sighted one. It looks at one particular discrete issue and ignores the much more serious and far more important principled issues that underpin this case. So there is this lack of sympathy, which, properly speaking, if this case has been reported in a proper way, I'm sure that there would be. I think with time, this is beginning to change. And I think that one of the other tragedies in all of this is that I sensed at the beginning of this year that public opinion was beginning to engage with this case rather more. And then unfortunately, the coronavirus hit, and we went into lockdown, and people started again to think about other things. But perhaps now, especially when it goes to the High Court, the perspective will change again, and the long tradition that does exist in Britain of support for civil rights, for people's and anti-imperialist, anti-war things, some of the things Kim Dotcom was talking about, that will start to surface, and people will understand that this is not just Julian Assange's battle, but it is their battle too.
It's an
Kevin,
open mic. We're about 1 minute from 2 hours. We might want to end it here unless anyone has anything pressing to say. It's been an extraordinary conversation, freewheeling, and hopefully informative for our viewers. Kim, you want
and in closing, I will just say a couple of things. Number one, the mainstream media, it's largely controlled and owned by billionaires who have other business interests. So they are using their media outlets as leverage to get deals with the government, better tax rates, better laws that protect their area of business. Of course, no one in that field wants to step on any toes, because they know that this is a very sensitive matter for the people in power that they depend on to expand their own power. So obviously they're not going to talk about this case, and that will continue. But on a positive note, you have to see how much is happening on the internet. And I made a tweet about this the other day. You can really see online discussion picking up about this. People who are tweeting from the courts, being followed, and a lot of people around the world observing this case live over the internet. And that's beautiful. And that is really where we are heading in the future. You know, these large media conglomerates that pick their editors based on their political leaning and tell them to shut up when it's not in their business interest to talk about, or report about certain topics, they are going out of business. I mean, one has to admit Trump has done us all a great service by continually pointing out that we have a fake news situation around the world, even though he does it for his own selfish reasons. But he is correct in that. And more people are waking up to this, and they are looking for alternative sources of information. So you do have a trend here, and I think it's only going to grow in the coming years, which is, of course, still going to put a limelight on Julian Assange's case on the internet. So that's number one. Number two, I think when we look at the threat that this case is for journalists, unfortunately not for the owners of the media companies, but for their employees, the people who are getting paid by the billionaires to write their stories. Once the journalists realize, even though their owners don't want them to report about it, that they are basically liable. If Julian Assange loses, they are liable for receiving information, even just processing it. They are liable for telling a source how to protect themselves against detection. They are liable for asking for certain information, to hold the government to account through the means of reporting. You know, this liability, the longer this case goes on, will burn itself more and more into the individuals that are the journalists. And I think sooner or later, they will wake up to the fact that it's not their bosses that are going to go to jail for reporting about national security stuff. It's them. You know, and they will be saying, well, I need to report about this. This is important for me. I'm your employee. I don't want to end up like Julian Assange and be in jail just because I received some confidential documents from the government that show war crimes or other crimes or corruption. So give this a bit more time. We have a perfect recipe here with this extradition hearing of these things coming out and the awareness growing. And also one has to remember, if Julian ever does get extradited, we will hear nothing about the war crimes or any of these things that we have a podium for now in this extradition hearing in the United States, because there is a different system. They can apply all kinds of national security rules, and it will be a closed hearing. We will never even have any observers in there. So this whole extradition stage is perfect for us to raise awareness about the methods of the US government, about the crimes that they are committing around the world, and how they are trying to blame journalists for us knowing the truth about this now. So, you know, journalists, I think, over time will realize the real danger to themselves. And ultimately, I think they will speak more about this case. And we have seen this. In the beginning, it was completely silent. Now you have more and more editorials calling out. You have more and more human rights organizations speaking out for Assange, petitions being raised by very credible organizations. Every day, there are more meaningful organizations joining the fight for Julian Assange. And I have been following this case from the beginning, and I feel currently Julian has a better standing than he had for many, many years, because all of this high-level support he gets from people that matter and organizations that matter. And that is only going to increase.
Thank you, Kim. Kevin, final word from you?
Yeah, and quickly, in a final comment, I would just say that we shouldn't let the prosecutors engage in revisionism and get us to think differently about history, to question what really in fact happened. To reference what is perhaps political cliche, we shouldn't be thinking that 2 + 2 = 5. I mean, we should believe that Barack Obama, in fact, made a choice through his Justice Department not to indict Julian Assange, and that matters. We shouldn't question that as fact in the way that the prosecutors are trying to get defense witnesses and others on the defense legal team to do, because it actually matters. It is a difference, and I myself recognize more than anyone, because I've been following, I mean, no more than anybody here, but I myself am very well aware of what Obama did and his legacy that has left an incredible effect on press freedom in a negative way, the way in which he targeted whistleblowers. You know, there are people who are friends of Consortium News and our media organizations like John Kiriakou and Thomas Drake, who suffered immensely because of what Barack Obama did. There's Edward Snowden, who remains isolated in Russia. But still, the very real fact is that there are, for several reasons, and some of them are very clear, but some of them maybe are more bureaucratic and more to do with professional or careerist reasons, perhaps. They did not indict Julian Assange when they had the chance, back when they had finished and completed their prosecution of Chelsea Manning. And we really need to continue to ask the very important question of why Obama didn't prosecute or indict Julian Assange, and why Donald Trump indicted and is prosecuting Julian Assange, because that difference lies at the core of why this case is proceeding. And it is going to be the key way in which we exonerate to the extent that he needs to be exonerated. It's going to go to our efforts to end the character assassination and public mobbing of Julian Assange.
Alexander, please.
Well, I agree. I think that this is absolutely true, and of course, rewriting of facts. I mean, one sees this happen in court cases. I mean, you know, we go inside the four walls of a courtroom, and you see how things that we know happened, actual facts, and they sort of seem to change and evolve as lawyers get their hands on them. We need to understand that there is truth, and this is a truth that mustn't be compromised in that way. The fact, just to say very quickly, on the question of whether Obama took a different line from the one that Trump did, all the indictments date from the time when the Trump administration was in office. You've never had any indictments under Obama, and that, it seems to me, tells the whole story. This attempt to claim that there was some kind of continuum of, you know, litigation going on in the United States. The indictments themselves, the date of them, shows that this is not true. But the most important fact we must always, you know, hold on to is the one that, you know, was brought up by both Kim Dotcom and by Kevin. This is a political trial. It's a political case. That's what's causing the prosecution all these problems. That's why Lewis is, you know, resorting to bombast and bullying. And when you have a political case, it has a date, it has a propensity to come unstuck. And that's what's happening. If it becomes unstuck, that's a good thing. But the political stakes, obviously, in a political trial are always very high. And for journalists, in this case, they could not be high.
Well, thank you, Alexander. And I want to thank, first of all, Trevor Timm, who came on. He was a star witness for the defense during the week.
Yeah.
We also had Stefania Maurizi, Italian journalist, with us, and Alexander Mercouris. Thank you, Stefania. I said to her already. Kevin Gosztola, thank you for joining us and staying with us all this time. Special thanks to Kim Dotcom who phoned in unexpectedly, and we are pleased to have his input. I also want to thank, of course, Elizabeth Voss, my co-host, Kathy Vogan, our executive producer. I want to remind everyone that we are doing nightly videos. Each day, court is in session. We will have next weekend another CN Live, just like this one, with another panel to discuss next week's events. And please go to our patreon.com/CN Live page and become a patron of CN Live. So until my next webcast on Monday night, and until next week, CN Live, this is Joe Lauria for Consortium News and CN Live. Thank you for being with us. Bye-bye.
Get out your notebook. There's more.
Kevin?